What if the greatest threat to your faith wasn't coming from outside the church at all? Not from atheists, not from secular culture, not from hostile governments or anti-religious activists. What if the threat was something far more difficult to recognize because it arrived wearing familiar clothing, speaking familiar language, and presenting itself as compassion? That question sits at the center of a growing debate among Catholics around the world. And few voices have sounded the alarm more forcefully than Chad Ripperger. For years, he has argued that many believers are facing a crisis they do not even realize exists. Not because they have abandoned their faith, but because they may have accepted a version of it that looks authentic on the surface while being fundamentally different underneath. And that distinction, according to Ripperger, changes everything. Because history shows that the most effective deceptions are rarely obvious. The obvious lies are easy to reject. The dangerous ones are the lies that contain just enough truth to feel trustworthy. They borrow familiar language. They appeal to good intentions. They make people feel secure. And because they feel secure, people stop asking questions. That is where this story begins. Imagine two Catholics walking into the same parish on Sunday morning. Both pray. Both believe in God. Both consider themselves faithful. Both sincerely want to live good lives. From the outside, they appear nearly identical. But beneath the surface, they may hold radically different understandings of what Catholicism actually teaches. One sees faith primarily as a source of comfort, affirmation, and belonging. The other sees faith as a path of transformation that often demands sacrifice, correction, and repentance. Both use the same words. Both speak about love. Both speak about mercy. Both speak about Jesus. But according to critics like Ripperger, the difference between those understandings is not small. It is enormous. And if that difference grows large enough, it can eventually reshape an entire religious culture. Yet before we can understand why this argument has become so controversial, we have to examine a deeper question. How does deception actually work? Most people assume deception begins when someone chooses the wrong action. But many theologians and philosophers throughout Christian history argued something very different. They argued that actions usually come later. First comes belief, then comes decision, then comes behavior. In other words, what a person believes about reality shapes everything that follows. And if that is true, then changing what people believe becomes far more powerful than simply changing what they do. That realization brings us to the heart of Ripperger's concern. He argues that many modern Catholics were never intentionally taught to reject church teaching. Instead, he believes they were gradually taught to view certain teachings differently, not through dramatic rebellion, not through open rejection, but through subtle shifts in emphasis, language, and interpretation. And those shifts, he argues, accumulated over decades. At first glance, that might sound impossible. After all, how could millions of people misunderstand the faith they practice every week? But then consider another question. If you stopped 10 Catholics after Mass and asked them to explain the primary purpose of the Mass itself, how many answers would be exactly the same? Some would describe it as a community gathering. Others might call it a celebration. Some would emphasize fellowship. Others would focus on worship. Still, others might struggle to explain it at all. And that observation leads directly into one of the examples Ripperger frequently uses. He argues that many Catholics today primarily understand the Mass through a communal lens. They see it as people coming together. They see it as a shared experience. They see it as an opportunity for connection. But he argues that traditional Catholic theology places something else at the center. Not the congregation, not the community, not even the experience. Instead, the central focus is sacrifice. Now, whether one agrees with Ripperger's conclusions or not, this distinction is critical because it reveals the deeper issue he is trying to highlight. The debate is not merely about definitions, it is about consequences. Because if a person believes Mass is primarily about community, then the quality of the experience naturally becomes important. The music matters. The atmosphere matters. The personality of the priest matters. The emotional impact matters. And if those elements disappoint, participation can begin to feel optional. But if a person sees Mass primarily as participation in something sacred and transcendent, then the experience itself becomes secondary. The focus shifts away from personal satisfaction. And that shift changes everything. Suddenly, attendance is no longer measured by whether someone enjoyed it. It is measured by whether it is true. But that observation raises an uncomfortable question. If these differences exist today, where did they come from? To answer that, supporters of Ripperger's position often point to a period of enormous change in the Catholic Church during the 20th century. Specifically, they point to the years surrounding the Second Vatican Council. Now, this is where the story becomes far more complicated than many people realize. Because Vatican II remains one of the most discussed, debated, and interpreted events in modern Catholic history. For some Catholics, it represented renewal. For others, confusion. For many, both the Council itself produced a series of official documents intended to address the modern world while remaining faithful to Catholic tradition. Yet, almost immediately, disagreements emerged regarding how those documents should be understood. And that disagreement did not remain confined to academic circles. It spread into seminaries, into schools, into parishes, into families, into everyday Catholic life. One side argued that the Council should be understood in continuity with everything that came before it. The other side often emphasized change, adaptation, and new approaches. And as these competing interpretations spread across the Church, confusion followed. The result was not one unified vision. The result was multiple competing visions, all claiming legitimacy. And that is where the tension begins to intensify. Because when ordinary Catholics encounter conflicting messages from trusted authorities, uncertainty becomes almost inevitable. One priest says one thing. Another says something else. One theologian emphasizes continuity. Another emphasizes development. One bishop stresses tradition. Another stresses adaptation. And somewhere in the middle sits the average believer trying to figure out what is actually true. According to Ripperger, that confusion created fertile ground for deeper problems. Not because confusion automatically destroys faith, but because prolonged confusion weakens confidence. And when confidence weakens, people often begin relying on something else, feelings, personal preferences, cultural trends, social approval. Whatever seems most persuasive in the moment. At first, that may not appear dangerous. In fact, it can feel liberating. After all, who doesn't want a faith that feels welcoming? Who doesn't want compassion? Who doesn't want mercy? But this is precisely where Ripperger argues the most important battle begins, because he believes one word in particular has undergone a dramatic transformation: mercy. And according to him, understanding what happened to that word may reveal the entire controversy. Mercy is one of the most powerful concepts in Christianity. It is woven into countless prayers, countless sermons, countless acts of devotion for centuries. Believers have relied upon the idea that God extends mercy even to those who have fallen. Without mercy, there is no hope. Without mercy, there is no redemption. Without mercy, there is no gospel. Yet Ripperger argues that a subtle shift occurred. A shift that changed not the popularity of mercy, but its meaning. Because traditionally, mercy and repentance were inseparable. Mercy was offered to the sinner, but mercy also called the sinner toward transformation. It did not merely comfort, it challenged, it healed, it changed. And according to Ripperger, some modern presentations of mercy emphasize acceptance while minimizing conversion. They focus on affirmation while reducing the urgency of repentance. They offer comfort without challenge, compassion without correction, understanding without transformation. And if that happens, he argues, something profound changes, because a message that begins with mercy may end somewhere entirely different. Yet this is where the story becomes even more fascinating, because very few people intentionally embrace error. Most people who adopt new ideas do so because those ideas appear good, reasonable, compassionate, even loving. That is why debates like this become so difficult. No one sees themselves as the villain. Everyone believes they are helping. Everyone believes they are defending something important. Everyone believes they are protecting the faith. And that means the conflict cannot be reduced to simple categories of good versus bad. Instead, it becomes a battle over interpretation itself. What does authentic compassion look like? What does authentic mercy require? What does authentic faithfulness demand? And who gets to answer those questions? For decades, Catholics across the world have wrestled with exactly those issues. Some argue that emphasis on strict doctrine risks pushing people away. Others argue that weakening doctrine risks losing the faith entirely. Some emphasize accompaniment. Others emphasize correction. Some focus on inclusion. Others focus on conversion. And because these debates touch deeply personal questions about identity, morality, and salvation, they generate enormous emotion. But beneath all the arguments lies an even deeper issue: authority. Because every religious tradition eventually faces the same challenge when disagreements arise. How do believers determine what is true? Do they look to personal experience, public opinion, theological experts, church documents, historical practice, current leadership? The answer matters because different sources can lead to very different conclusions. And according to Ripperger, many Catholics have gradually shifted away from one source of authority toward another without fully realizing it. That claim sits at the center of his warning. But if his diagnosis is correct, then a far bigger question emerges. How deep does the problem actually go? Is it limited to isolated disagreements? Or has it reached the very foundations of Catholic life itself? Because the next issue Ripperger raises is not about private belief. It is not about theological theories. It is not even about individual morality. It is about something every Catholic encounters: whenever they walk through the doors of a church, the liturgy. And according to him, this is where the story takes its most dramatic turn. Because if the liturgy shapes belief, and belief shapes action, then changing worship may ultimately change everything else. The question is whether that is what happened. And the answer depends entirely on which version of the story you believe. Because once we step into the battle over the liturgy, we are entering one of the most controversial and emotionally charged debates in modern Catholic history. And what happens next reveals why so many Catholics believe the struggle is far from over. The debate over the liturgy is not really about music. It is not really about Latin versus the vernacular. It is not even primarily about aesthetics. Those are simply the visible symptoms of a much deeper argument. And according to Chad Ripperger and many traditional Catholics, the real question is this: what does worship teach people about God? Because every generation is formed by what it repeatedly experiences. People become what they practice. They absorb messages long before they consciously analyze them. And that means the way a person worships eventually shapes the way a person believes. That is why the battle over the liturgy has become so intense. Both sides understand that worship is not merely an expression of belief. Worship creates belief. It forms habits. It forms expectations. It forms an entire worldview. And if that worldview changes, everything built upon it can change as well. Supporters of traditional forms of worship argue that certain changes after Vatican II unintentionally shifted attention away from transcendence and toward human experience. They argue that the emphasis gradually moved from mystery to accessibility, from sacrifice to celebration, from eternity to immediacy. Whether one agrees with that assessment or not, the perception itself has become enormously influential because it has fueled a movement that continues growing around the world. But here is where the story becomes even more surprising. Despite decades of predictions that traditional expressions of Catholicism would disappear, many observers noticed something unexpected. Young Catholics began rediscovering them, not because they had lived through the old era, not because of nostalgia. Many of them had never experienced any of it before, yet they were seeking it out. And that development created a question that neither critics nor supporters could easily ignore. Why would young people raised entirely in the modern world become interested in practices their grandparents had abandoned? For traditionalists, the answer seemed obvious. They argued that human beings hunger for transcendence. They hunger for mystery. They hunger for beauty. And when they encounter something that feels rooted, ancient, and sacred, they recognize it immediately. But critics offered a different explanation. They argued that the attraction reflected cultural uncertainty. In a rapidly changing world, people naturally seek stability. Therefore, the growth of traditional movements may say more about modern anxiety than about theological correctness. And once again, the debate deepened, because with every argument about liturgy stood a larger argument about tradition itself. What exactly is tradition? Is it merely the preservation of old customs, or is it something far more important? For Ripperger, tradition is not simply a collection of historical practices. It is the living transmission of truth across generations. It is the accumulated wisdom of saints, theologians, martyrs, and believers stretching back centuries. And because he views tradition that way, Attacks on tradition appear far more serious than simple disagreements about style. They appear existential. They appear foundational. They appear dangerous, yet perhaps the most controversial part of his argument is not his discussion of worship or doctrine. It is his claim that attachment to tradition has increasingly been treated as a psychological problem rather than a theological position. According to this perspective, people who insist on doctrinal clarity are often labeled rigid. People who defend older practices are portrayed as fearful. People who resist change are characterized as unhealthy or extreme. Now, whether that characterization is fair or unfair is itself hotly disputed. But Ripperger argues that the effect is powerful regardless, because once a debate shifts from ideas to personalities, something changes. The question is no longer whether an argument is true. The question becomes whether the person making it is psychologically acceptable. And that shift can be devastating. Why? Because most people fear social rejection more than intellectual defeat. Very few individuals abandon their convictions because they have been logically refuted. Many abandon them because they are tired of being mocked, tired of being isolated, tired of being labeled, tired of standing alone. And according to Ripperger, that dynamic has played a significant role in modern Catholic life. But then comes perhaps the most dramatic turn in his entire argument. Because up until this point, everything could be explained in human terms. Cultural pressures, institutional decisions, educational failures, historical controversies. Then Ripperger introduces another dimension entirely, the supernatural. As an exorcist, he approaches the issue differently than most commentators. He does not view spiritual confusion solely through political, sociological, or theological lenses. He views it through the lens of spiritual warfare. And whether viewers agree with that perspective or not, it dramatically changes the stakes. Because if the crisis is merely human, then human solutions may be sufficient. But if the crisis is spiritual, then something far deeper is happening beneath the surface. Ripperger argues that evil rarely attacks where people expect it. It does not always seek immediate destruction. Instead, it often seeks gradual corruption, not open rebellion, subtle compromise, not dramatic collapse, slow erosion, not obvious falsehood, carefully disguised confusion. And according to him, that is precisely why discernment matters, because a direct attack can be resisted. A hidden attack often goes unnoticed. The person being influenced may genuinely believe they are moving toward truth, while gradually drifting away from it. That possibility is what gives his warnings such urgency. Yet, despite the seriousness of his concerns, Ripperger ultimately does not end with fear. He ends with responsibility. Because if deception exists, then the answer cannot be panic. The answer must be formation, learning, prayer, study, discipline, growth. In his view, the solution begins when Catholics know their faith deeply enough to recognize the difference between authentic teaching and distorted versions of it. Not through slogans. Not through social media. Not through secondhand summaries. Through direct engagement with the faith itself. Because ignorance creates vulnerability. Knowledge creates clarity, and clarity creates stability. But knowledge alone is not enough. That is another point he repeatedly emphasizes. A person can possess information without transformation. A person can memorize doctrines without becoming holy, a person can win arguments and still lose their soul. Therefore, intellectual formation must be accompanied by spiritual formation. Prayer becomes essential. Sacramental life becomes essential. Self-examination becomes essential. Because the goal is not merely to know the truth. The goal is to live it. And that brings us to perhaps the most important lesson hidden beneath this entire debate. Regardless of where someone stands on liturgy, tradition, church politics, or theological controversies, every Catholic eventually faces the same question. What kind of faith are they building? A faith based on convenience or conviction? A faith based on comfort or commitment? A faith that changes with every cultural shift? Or a faith capable of surviving storms? Those questions matter because history has never been kind to shallow convictions. Every generation eventually faces challenges it did not expect. Every generation encounters confusion. Every generation experiences pressure. And when those moments arrive, borrowed beliefs rarely survive. Only convictions, personally examined, personally embraced, and personally lived, can endure. That is why this conversation continues attracting attention far beyond academic theology. It touches something universal: the fear of being misled, the desire to find truth, the struggle to remain faithful in a changing world. And perhaps that is the real reason so many people continue listening. Because beneath every controversy lies a deeper human concern, not simply whether institutions have changed, not simply whether traditions have been preserved, but whether ordinary believers can still find a path through the confusion. For Chad Ripperger, the answer is yes, but only if people are willing to ask difficult questions. Only if they are willing to challenge comfortable assumptions. Only if they are willing to pursue truth, even when that pursuit becomes costly. Because truth, in his view, is not always easy. It is not always popular. It does not always flatter. But he argues that its purpose was never to flatter. Its purpose was to save. And that is where this story ultimately ends. Not with certainty about every controversy, not with the resolution of every debate, not with the end of every disagreement, but with a challenge directed not at institutions, theologians, bishops, or commentators, a challenge directed at every individual believer. Now what you believe. Know why you believe it. Examine it carefully. Protect it diligently. And never assume that sincerity alone guarantees accuracy, because throughout history, some of the most influential deceptions succeeded, not because people were malicious, but because they were unprepared. And according to Chad Ripperger, that is precisely why vigilance matters now more than ever. The question is whether people are willing to listen before it is too late.